Well, welcome to Coffee and a Mic. Today we're joined by State Senator Jake Hoffman.
Thanks for having me.
Senator Hoffman, thank you for being here.
Of course.
You have a little bit of a unique history with Queen Creek. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
I do. Well, so I've actually represented Queen Creek since 2013, started originally on the Higley Unified School District Governing Board and only represented a couple of neighborhoods, but it was Queen Creek nonetheless. And then a few years later, I moved into Queen Creek and ran for the town council and got to serve with people like Mayor Julia Wheatley and a lot of really good folks on the town level. And that was a really trying time because that was during COVID, right? That was my last year on council was during COVID. And so, we went from, everything was hunky-dory and our town was the fastest growing municipality in the state and we were thriving and burgeoning to dealing with something that was completely, out of the ordinary. And our council dealt with it extremely well. And then I was blessed. I ran for the House of Representatives and represented Queen Creek down at the State House. And now I'm fortunate to represent Queen Creek in the State Senate.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your service. And currently you serve on several boards, several committees down there for us. You're on appropriations, transportation,
yep,
government, one other?
The newly formed Committee on Director Nominations.
Director nominations.
Yes.
So that one particularly important now with the change in at the governor's level, right?
That's true.
So
yeah.
How does that work? What is that about?
Well, so like at the federal level, our Constitution provides for checks and balances. And so that means that the Senate is responsible for confirming the nominees that the governor appoints to lead agencies like the Department of Health Services, Department of Public Safety, Department of Child Safety. And so what the Senate did this time is they took a slightly different approach. In Arizona, we've always kind of had a performative rubber stamp, if you will, when it comes to gubernatorial nominees. And the Senate majority felt that it was time to actually implement a process that would allow for an honest, accurate, and thorough vetting of these nominees, something that really hasn't happened in the past. And so we created the Committee on Director Nominations. And so each member of the committee meets with the nominees. We have research staff that researches their history in government, in the private sector, to better understand their qualifications, their experience, and really, if they have outside political agendas or are mouthpieces or beholden to outside kind of partisan groups, right? Or whether their experience lends to them being a faithful steward of the laws that this state has, right? We understand that as a compound republic and with a three-branch system of government, the legislature has the authority to create the laws, and the executive's job is to faithfully execute those laws. And so we want to ensure that the priorities of our constituents align with the vision and the experience and credentials of those who are going to be tasked with leading these really important agencies.
So making sure that those agencies are well managed and overseen. So what type of backlog do you have right now? Are these going fairly quickly, or are there a lot of positions that need to be looked at still? So
we've done 4 so far. 50% of them we've recommended to move forward with a confirmation vote. And then one, we actually recommended a rejection of the nominee due to the experience and the policies that they advocate for. And then another one we've held right now because there's additional due diligence and conversations that are needed. But I will tell you that it's important that this committee exist because what we saw just yesterday with the nominee to lead the Department of Child Safety, this is an agency that is responsible for taking care of the most vulnerable children in our state. And the individual had been on the job about 50 days. We still actually, as the Senate, have not received the nomination paperwork from the governor's office for this person. But we started doing our research and we actually had a whistleblower come to us from within the agency and bring to light some really troubling elements that have existed already. Things like questionable consulting contracts that have been put in place, multiple senior staff firings, largely for no given reason. And then allegedly there are numerous EEOC complaints because, again, allegedly the individual fired 4 openly gay employees, because of their homosexuality. And so these are the kinds of things that we want to make sure that the agencies aren't, getting bogged down in these kinds of situations and antics and concerns, and instead are able to do the job that the people of Arizona rely on them to do.
Does the legislature have ongoing oversight of those agencies? Because it seems CPS and now DCS has been troubled for quite a while.
So the legislature has oversight authority for all of the executive branch when it comes to a traditional oversight role. And so that means we have the ability to make inquiries, subpoena for records, things like that. And certainly there are folks at the legislature, Democrats and Republicans, who are concerned especially about things like DCS, Department of Child Safety, and making sure that that is operating at peak efficiency and that problems are being ferreted out and addressed when they come up. But in terms of the nominees, the committee has purview over them until the point that they are confirmed or rejected. Once they're confirmed, they can serve in that position for, potentially the entirety of Katie Hobbs's term. And so that's, again, why it's important that we go through this process, put the due diligence in on the front end, and make sure that these are the right people who are going to do the job that the people need.
Wonderful. So we're about not quite halfway into the session. Started off fairly quietly with about 300 bills, I think, in that first week, and now we're sitting at something along 1,600, more or less. So picked up speed quite a bit. And at this stage, where we're just getting ready for crossover, where bills go from one house to the other to be heard, where do you think we are, and what are your priorities? I'm looking at some of the ones that you've sponsored or co-sponsored, and it seems to be centered around election and transportation, but tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so transportation infrastructure and transportation policy is one of the core elements of government. Obviously here in Queen Creek, we care tremendously about transportation, right? Better roads has been, I think, the campaign slogan for just about every person that's run for probably a decade and a half now. And I think it will continue to be, right? Because we have all the pass-through traffic that comes through from Santan Valley, and as Florence continues to grow, transportation isn't going away. And so I actually asked to be on the Transportation and Technology Committee so that I could play a role in things like the I-10 widening. The federal government denied the matching grant for widening the I-10, and so right now the state has actually taken it upon ourselves. TJ Shope, we're working with him, and he has a bill to expand the I-10 using state dollars. And it's a big price tag, but it's a big economic impact.
About
$360 million.
Right.
But the reality is that being able to move commerce from Tucson to Phoenix and through our state faster and more efficiently, that benefits every single person in the state because it creates more economic opportunity, allows us to attract new businesses to the state. But another one that's right here in our backyard is the SR-24. And this is not only important for alleviating road congestion for our own residents here in Queen Creek, but I represent Santan Valley as well. That's going to cut down commute times for folks in Santan Valley significantly, and it's going to allow significant economic opportunity to come right here into Queen Creek. And we've seen the LG plant that wants to come in. Fujifilm has already located down there off of the 24 that's been extended so far. And so I'm really focused right now on getting not just a little bit of funding for the 24, but the full $65 million that's needed to get it all the way out to the canal, so that we can, realize those opportunities, take advantage of that economic development, and continue to make Queen Creek and Southeast Mesa and Santan Valley, which I represent, the best possible place to work, live, and play.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. So they built it out as a temporary parkway. As I like to tell every legislator I can get hold of, it's already over capacity.
Yeah.
And really important that we get that additional funding. So I think one of the bills that was in there was going to put out something along the lines of 18 million, which I think was just enough for some right-of-way and some of the studies and not much else.
Yeah.
The bill that you put forth for the full amount, does that take it from parkway status to freeway, or does it stay parkway at that level?
So at that level, it still stays parkway, but it takes it out further, which is going to give us less bottlenecking, if you will, as Santan Valley residents try to access that freeway. Certainly, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and I've been working closely with Queen Creek, with Pinal County, so that we can identify what are the things that we can bite off right now, get done right now, and then as we have opportunities to speed other elements of the project along, I'm going to be right there in the trenches making sure that it happens.
We'll circle back to that one because I want to get back to the full funding for the 24 in just a minute. But a couple of the other projects were the Hunt Highway, and so that would widen Hunt Highway headed towards Florence and Coolidge. And so important for moving through those corridors is Coolidge is particular landed quite a few manufacturing facilities. So
that's right.
And then you have quite a few election bills. Tell us about that. What are those centered around, and what's happening there?
Well, look, my view on elections is that the Constitution has given the legislature the authority for oversight and management of election policy, and so just like imagine you're in school and you take a test and you get a bad grade, right? Well, we know over the last couple of years, right, wrong, or indifferent, we've gotten a pretty poor grade when it comes to elections. Voter confidence has struggled. Sometimes it's reached an all-time low. And so now imagine that teacher never told you what you did wrong, right? It would be really hard to improve and move forward. And so my view is that we need to constantly be working with our election officials, working with people in the county recorder's office and the Secretary of State's office, and some of the brightest minds when it comes to elections. Excuse me. When it comes to elections across the country, so that we can be improving our system of elections as best as possible and making sure that it's easy to access places to vote, that that's legal citizens are voting, right, and that we're not building barriers, but we're actually increasing not only trust and safety, but also accessibility and convenience.
And I think you have about 6 to 8, it looks like. Some of them, you mentioned the polling places, so some of them say that early ballots can only be dropped at a polling place. Is that correct?
Well, so I have a couple of ones actually regarding early ballots. One, I want to improve the convenience factor for people when they drop off an early ballot. Right now, you have to go through an adjudication process where you have to verify your signature, things like that. And so I think we should be able to have more polling places, so that instead of having to drive, in some cases, 15 or 20 minutes to access a voting center, right? You only have to drive, 4 or 5 minutes to access a polling place. But when you go in and you take your early ballot, I think it would make a lot of sense if you're able to scan your ID and check in using the normal process that anyone who goes and votes early in person or votes day of, use that same process so that you can actually run your ballot right through the tabulator while you're there on site, as opposed to having to submit your ballot and then wait for a phone call to see if your signature is actually your signature, right?
And so is there enough polling workers and things like that? I know that was an issue in one of the recent elections, and the county elections department has been talking about that.
Well, I think, Chris, Republicans and Democrats alike are more engaged than ever when it comes to the election process. And so we saw a major uptick in people asking to be poll workers in the last election cycle. And we have to remember, it's a recent phenomenon, this shift to a voting center model. If you go back just to 2018 here in Maricopa County, it was still largely polling center based, so precinct level voting. And so myself and Senator Mesnard and Senator Kavanaugh, there are a number of folks from all ends of the Republican spectrum that are working on this very issue. How do we make it more convenient to access a polling place so that you can actually go and interact with a poll worker like we used to, right? And one of those opportunities is schools. There's a bill right now, I believe Senator Mesnard has it, that would give all students the day off, so that schools, gymnasiums, things like that, could be utilized as polling places like they were in the past, but without the burden being placed on the school districts to manage both student safety and providing the opportunity for a polling place.
And so a couple of the bills then require hand counts rather than machine counts. And I don't think any of those were necessarily yours, but how would that work then with those additional polling places and things like that? So you would go in, fill out your ballot, and then what would happen from there?
Well, so Chris, I'm not on the elections committee, and I don't have any bills that deal with hand counts, so I can't speak to the specifics of those bills because I actually haven't seen them.
Okay, fair enough. Back to a couple of the other major issues, though, affecting Queen Creek in particular, and whether or not they have gotten to your level. So one is important on water. And so last year, or last session, Queen Creek was able to secure water rights off of the Colorado. Coming out of Kingman is a bill this year to stop transfers from the Colorado. Where do you see that going, and what do you think?
Well, so I can tell you that bill, at least the Senate version of that bill, is already dead. That bill was sent to my committee, so I chair the Senate Committee on Government, and that bill was sent to my committee, and in working with stakeholders here in Queen Creek, in Pinal County, as well as other legislators who understand the complex dynamics of water policy, right? And preserving options for places like Queen Creek, as the fastest growing municipality in the state of Arizona, right? Preserving options for us to be able to responsibly find as many water sources as possible so that we can provide that 100-year assurance for every person that calls Queen Creek home. So that bill is thankfully dead in the Senate.
That is good news for Queen Creek. And speaking of that 100-year assured supply, so there were several rumors, if you will, about perhaps lowering that threshold so that some places in the state could make development a little bit easier. And how do you see that?
Well, there's the old saying that, whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting, right? And I think that this is a perfect example of that. This is a complex issue, and so from my perspective, I'm here to represent the needs of the town of Queen Creek, of Santan Valley, and of a little sliver of Southeast Mesa, right? And so I spend a lot of time talking with staff here in Queen Creek. Thankfully, we've got a fantastic council here in Queen Creek. We've got a fantastic new mayor. I know she's sitting in the room, so trying to get a gold star. But no, really, we do. We have a fantastic team in Queen Creek, and they have been, thanks to Paul Gardner and the great work that he's doing with our utilities, they are leading the way, in my view, in terms of finding responsible solutions for the water debate, right? And for meeting the needs of the people of Queen Creek. And so I'm going to continue to work with them and with Pinal County to find every possible option that makes sense, both in the short term and in the long term.
And as we go forward, we're sitting here with record snowfall over the last couple of weeks, but in the long range picture, it looks like we're still going to be having those discussions with the other states.
Yeah.
Do you have any projections on how you see those coming out? What do you think our water world might look like going forward?
That's a great question. So the ADWR, the Arizona Department of Water Resources nominee, is going to be one that has to be vetted very thoroughly because, as you said, this is going to be a conversation between multiple states. And what we've learned over the last few years is not all of those states necessarily play fairly, right? California tends to view themselves as the, million-pound gorilla in the conversation. And so, it's going to be imperative that we have an ADWR that is willing to go to bat for Arizona and aggressively fight for the interests of our state. And so that'll be something that the nominations committee looks at very, very closely. But even from our other committees, our Natural Resources, Energy, and Water Committee, I know they're already keyed in to this debate. The Committee on Government, my committee, we will be keyed in on this debate, and we will continue to push the Hobbs administration, the ADWR, and quite honestly, every county board of supervisor, every municipality needs to be vocal and engaged in this process so that Arizona can present as a unified front in those conversations so that we reach the best outcomes possible.
And I think as an economic development tool, really important that we have those conversations, but that we show people that we do have water. Yeah. Arizona has planned for a long time for this kind of situation.
That's right.
We had somebody from SRP here who said it's always been clear that we live in a desert. And so as we bring in those big projects, important to know that we do have water, we do have sources for that water.
Well, look, Arizona's done a great job when it comes to water conservation. If you look at our usage now, being exponentially larger than in the 1950s, we actually consume less water today than we did then. And that's thanks to conservation efforts, mitigation efforts, a really responsible, focused approach. And it's one of the most important things that I think businesses need to be aware of. And quite honestly, I think they are, despite some of the narrative that may exist, on the media landscape. We have folks like LG and companies like that who want to relocate, want to come here to Queen Creek because they know we do have the water and we have the workforce, we have the great cost of living. There's a lot of benefit to being in Arizona, especially now that we have the flat tax, which is something we did a couple years ago.
Right, and we appreciate that. Two bills I'd like to get to as we wrap up.
Sure.
1117. Which is a bill that affects zoning, originally done with the intent of making housing affordable, but essentially does away with local zoning controls. What is your position on that, and where do you see that bill going?
Well, 1117 is the second iteration of the bill. Then Representative Kaiser brought it last year as well, and it was significantly more aggressive than it is in its current form. I will be very open. I have spoken with stakeholders that have been in those meetings. I've spoken with town staff. And I've spoken with my fellow senators, and I have some concerns. Queen Creek is a community very much like a Paradise Valley or a North Scottsdale that has designed itself. Its appeal is because we have larger lots. We have a lot of unique character on those lots. And so, I question whether it is the prudent thing to do to create a by right zoning opportunity where 4,000 square foot lots become the de facto norm, and it now becomes a fight from the public to demand a product that is different than that, right? So I think, quite honestly, in talking with other senators, I think the bill is going to struggle. This is certainly, like I said, the second iteration. So if it does struggle, I would expect next year there will be a third iteration. So we need to keep our eye on it, but that's where I'm at.
And that's good to hear. Affordable housing is an important topic. We need to do something, but doing away with local zoning controls is not a good idea. For anybody who doesn't know about that bill in particular, does away with housing standards of any type. So build whatever you like out of whatever material you might want. Build apartments wherever. as long as it was zoned for residential, and go up to heights of at least 6 stories, if not 8 or more. And so the idea being that they can build them faster, which is it is a concern in some locations. Queen Creek has done a pretty good job with making sure that permits go through quickly. I don't, you may have been on council when we went to that electronic
There was.
electronic system, which was a lot of foresight there.
Well, and Chris, just quickly, I will tell you that in conversations with the stakeholders, I hold up Queen Creek often as the example of what good, conservative, smart government should look like, right? We went from an environment that was, let's call it, less open to development, right? Going back, 6, 7, 8 years ago. But over, from 2016 to 2022, right, this council has committed itself to wanting the best possible products, to giving developers the most possible creativity, which is why we're seeing really unique, incredible housing products that are coming in. And we've created an environment that fosters development and works in partnership with them. And so, my comments to the stakeholders are, you're potentially taking away the ability for good cities to act in a good, responsible way. And so, questioning whether or not that's the right approach to go.
Which we definitely agree with, so thank you. The final one is 1122. This one is the transportation bill that would extend, essentially known as Prop 400, the half-cent sales tax that's been used since the 80s to pay for our freeway infrastructure. When we were in our pre-meeting, we were discussing how long people have been here, and when I first got here, there was just one little section of freeway and not much else. And so all of that has been built coming off of this half-cent sales tax. It's set to expire in the next couple of years, and Maricopa County has to go through the state legislature to get it on a ballot so that Maricopa voters can see it. And it's become controversial, and the current version basically strips out funding for transit. It seems to be stalled out in the committee itself. So how is it going to move forward? How do we get what we had, say, last year, and at least get it on the ballot and let the people decide?
Well, so Chris, this is a very complex issue. And when you look at the plan, right, so this tax that you're talking about was sold to voters in the 80s, right? And then again in the early 2000s. And now again, when it was sold to the voters in the 80s, it was to build major arterials and to build highways, right? And it morphed in the early 2000s to become very transit heavy. And so that goes, billions of dollars to go towards things like light rail. Light rail, by the way, total ridership is 0.9% of all commuters in Maricopa County, yet it accounted for almost 1/3 of the total cost of that tax over the last 20 years. And so the committee has taken, I believe, a very prudent approach. We've said we need to refocus this tax so that it goes towards reducing congestion on our freeways and on our roadways, reducing commute times for people who are traveling and commuting throughout our state, throughout our county, right? And it needs to focus primarily on building highways and freeways. It needs to focus primarily on building major arterials, right? Queen Creek, for example, has a ton of projects that are on this project list. And those need to be the priority. Unfortunately, in the plan that was put forward last year by the Maricopa Association of Governments, by MAG, it was over 40%, the largest of the 3 buckets, was for light rail and transit. And that's simply out of balance with the needs that we have here. And so what the committee did is said, look, let's recalibrate. Let's focus on bus lines, so maintaining all of our bus lines, our rapid bus transit option for commuters. Let's focus on expanding bus lines. And so we actually upped the percentage of transit from 5%, which is what Senator Farnsworth started at, to 20% in committee, which was actually nearly quadruple the amount needed to maintain all of those bus routes and to expand new ones, right? And so we believe that it needs to focus on those kind of core elements. I think we're going to see it come back. It's dead for now. There is a House version, but I think we're going to see it come back here in the next few weeks, and we'll reopen this debate.
I think the hardest thing about that debate is the plan did come forward from MAG. So you had 20-something mayors, staff, all compromise and agree on that particular plan. Being the closest to the issue, do they not have the greatest say in how it should go?
So, Chris, I mean, look, having served on a council, I understand how that works, right? But the reality is that we should not be taxing the overwhelming majority of Maricopa County residents, right? Billions of dollars. I mean, we're talking here tens of billions of dollars over the course of 20 years to funnel into a light rail project, which is going to siphon off billions of taxpayer dollars when 0.9% of people ride the light rail. That is simply poor government. And so while I understand that mayors and cities got together, there's a dynamic in MAG where the Mesa, Phoenix, kind of Glendale, right, the big cities, throw around a lot of weight in that process. And to be quite fair, Queen Creek has been a donor city for nearly the last 30 years when it comes to MAG, or when it comes to this tax and this transportation plan. We have not reaped the benefits of it, but we have given all of our money over to everyone else, okay? And I think it is important that we get Queen Creek made whole, get taken care of, and that we get the money for these things that are desperately needed, these major arterial projects. I think it's $150 million that needs to come to Queen Creek in this plan. And if we're siphoning off 40, 44, 45% to go towards things like light rail, that 0.9% of people ride, I don't believe that's in the best interest of Queen Creek. I want to see the money come here so that we get SR 24 moved out faster, right? So that we get it to raised overpasses instead of at grade. I want to see us get our major arterials done so that people have faster commute times and less congestion on our roads. Those are the things that I'm focused on, and I think that's where I'm at when it comes to the debate on 1122.
The ridership question, you're right currently, and you look at systems like DART and BART, and those would be the Dallas area and the one in San Francisco, at some point it tips and people begin riding. But I think one of the things that I look at most often is the redevelopment that's occurred along those lines in Mesa. Those neighborhoods are night and day, particularly as you start near the temple and move into the downtown area. So the money that it brings for redevelopment, the ASU campuses, things like that, is a very important consideration as well. But I thank you for your thoughts on 1122.
So Chris, on the ridership issue, the DART and BART, those are highly urbanized zones where those operate, right? Maricopa County is inherently a different product, and so because it is a fixed rail product, we will never see, and their MAG's own projections show this. This is not, Jake Hoffman's opinion. This is MAG's own projections going out 5, 10 years, right, 20 years. We will never see the type of ridership that a BART product has in San Francisco because we're so right. Disparate and suburban.
BART is not a fair just because of its compact nature and how that city developed. But I think the DART is more interesting because it was used. Goldwater Institute used to talk about it as being a failed system. back in its original start. And as you see the redevelopment along those lines, they become the centers, right? More of the housing goes along them. And when you look at 1117, the bill that we talked about for zoning, it specifically says that you can't limit apartments to less than 8 stories if it's within a mile of a transit center like that. So you can see how they're encouraging the high density to go along the rail lines. But
well, so Chris, I don't represent Mesa, and I don't represent Phoenix, and I don't represent Tempe, right? I represent Queen Creek, Santan Valley, and Southeast Mesa, and so that's who I'm focused on.
Absolutely, and it's just a matter of getting it out so that the Maricopa County voters can vote on it. I think we have reached our time limit, but I want to thank you for being here. I hope that you'll join us at the end of the session so we can talk about how some of these things turned out.
I would love to do a wrap-up, yeah.
And we appreciate you all being here. Any final questions that anybody might have from the group?
I'm just curious, following up on that last discussion about transportation. So I was in the auto industry for a short while, and autonomous vehicles were developing very quickly. And so I went to Ann Arbor and saw the little autonomous vehicle testing area they had and stuff, and all the exciting things happening. And that's a big question mark, I think, that gets thrown into the whole transportation debate, right, in the commuting and light rail and what have you, what impact that's going to have. And I guess just thinking about what you were saying, Senator, if we could relieve congestion in places like Mesa and Tempe and more inner city, that helps us because then we can get into the town more quickly. I mean, it relieves congestion coming in if you're driving from a place like Queen Creek where maybe light rail isn't available. And I don't know that light rail is the answer given the way things are changing in the world, but I'm just curious if you have a kind of a bigger picture view long term, because Phoenix continues to grow very rapidly. Maybe we're 10 million people in however many years, down the road, and it is much more dense. Do you have a thought about the right policy approach to trying to figure out how do we make all that work and things flow, other than just building more and more highways, or maybe that is the answer? I don't know.
Well, definitely because of the geographic nature of Maricopa County, right? Wider highways, more highway lanes. There's highways in the West Valley that need to be, created. There's highways. We have the SR-24. We have the North-South, which is Pinal County, but nonetheless, right, there are highways that are needed just because of the nature of our communities. So certainly that is the immediate, kind of the 20-year goal needs to be focused on that. But I will tell you on the innovation side with regards to autonomous vehicles and things like that, the piece of the Transportation Committee that most people overlook is we're actually the Transportation and Technology Committee. And so those things all flow through us. And I will tell you, I'm actually rather excited because the nominee for the Arizona Department of Transportation that we just voted this past Monday to confirm, and the full Senate voted on Wednesday to confirm, is very heavily focused on how do we create the most friendly environment for innovation when it comes to transportation as possible. And so those are things we are looking from a more holistic 30,000-foot view because they're going to be a necessary part of the transportation conversation, and they will play a very large role in terms of supplanting things like light rail, right? Because they will be exponentially more convenient. Imagine living a mile off of the light rail, right, which is the zone that you were talking about. So they put in an 8-story apartment complex and it's 0.8 miles off the light rail. What's 120 outside? And you have to walk to the light rail in a suit, right? That's not the most convenient option. Whereas an autonomous vehicle that comes and meets you at your door, I believe that's probably going to be a more significant player in terms of the wave of the future. Yeah.
I just want to say thank you for your representation of Queen Creek, and specifically with our State Route 24 and the budget appropriations that you're working on to the tune of almost $65 million, so that's much appreciated.
Thank you.
With the Prop 400 extension, and understanding the transit aspect of it, and also understanding the bigger cities that you talk about, Phoenix and Mesa Tempe, and where they're at with their ultimate build out, and their needs are different, but also understanding they're the largest percentage of population as far as voters, and so knowing that it is ultimately this extension is voter approved, and knowing that voters vote what's in it for me, how do we bridge that? How do we get their support from communities as populated as they are, as built out as they are in their transportation needs and demands, to have what's in it for them, to be able to get them to be a yes vote, to have the impact on Queen Creek to the tune of $300 million. And like you said, we have been a donor community for so long. How do we bridge that? How do you see that?
That's a great question. So I think it's really important to look, as we begin the conversation, it's important to look at MAG's projections, both current and forward-looking, when it comes to total ridership, transit at large, right? So that's bus, rail, things like that, okay? It's 1.8% today, right? 1.8% of all commuters utilize either a bus line or a light rail or some form of transit in terms of the modality with how they commute. Their projections are that is actually falling to 1.3%, and they expect in the long term it will jump back up, but it may only jump back up to 2 or 2.5%. Okay, and so when you look at even the people in Tempe and Phoenix, and let's call it the central western portions of Mesa, they're choosing by their own behavior, right, not to utilize that modality, and so the impact, I think, is much more relegated towards government, and the desires of city planners and urban planners in Tempe and Phoenix and those places, rather than the actual voters. And I'll tell you, I actually asked one of the MAG representatives point blank. I said, if we were to go back to last year's plan, but split it into 2 votes, would you be willing to do that, right? So transit gets its own standalone vote, highways and arterials get its own standalone vote, but utilizing their plan that was proposed last year. And they said absolutely not. And they said because the transit one will fail. And so the reality is that when you're talking about billions of dollars, they know that they don't have voter support for the transit piece because it is so minimally utilized. And so I think, look, we're not stripping transit from the plan, right? And Senator Farnsworth, to his credit, was willing to work with Senator Carroll, who wants to ensure that bus lines, which is the most utilized component of the transit program, he wants to make sure that stays in there. And so we had actually a kind of a 3 dueling amendments in committee. We had Anthony Kern, Senator Kern, who represents Phoenix. He brought a 10%, right? So it would move it from 5% to 10%. I had a 15%, and Senator Farnsworth had a 20%. And the committee voted, including Senator Kern and myself, even though it doesn't reflect what our communities want, right? We voted for the 20%. Because we recognize that there is a need for transit. But if we're going to do it, if we're going to spend precious tax dollars, we should be spending it on the modalities of transit that people are actually utilizing, right? And so I think we can get there. I really do. It's just a matter of hashing out the details, and it may take us till next year, which I don't really want, right? I'd like to get this done this year so that we have lots of runway to talk to our voters and make sure that they understand what the benefit is to them, but I'm confident we're going to get this done. It's just a matter of getting all the ducks in a row, if you will, down at the Capitol, and making sure that everybody's on the same page. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, thank you, everybody.
Okay. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it.